Hey, Patrick, can you hear me okay? Okay, appreciate it. Nice sound check there.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
All right.
How are you?
I'm good. Hope you
Good.
are.
Good, yeah, good. It's actually cooler here this evening, so it's going to be nice to go for a walk around the stupa after class tonight.
That would be a great idea. It's supposed to get hotter Thursday.
Yeah, some record-breaking heat or something.
Yeah, I hope the summer's not going to be that hot.
Uh, I hope I hope it's not a sign of things to come.
Yeah, we're in for a long summer if that's the case.
Hey, John, what nationality is Costello? Is that Spanish?
English and French, I think.
Is it? Okay. I love the history of people's names.
Relatives are apparently the keeper of the lower gates of the castle.
Ah, okay. That's okay. Welcome. Hi, Allison and Tara. Welcome. Glad you guys are
Hi.
here.
Thank you.
We'll be starting shortly.
Hello.
Hi. Glad you're here. We're getting settled in and online and everybody up and running. So give us just a few minutes. John is here, so we'll be starting on time. Okay, welcome everyone. We still got a few last minute people joining us on Zoom, so give it just another minute for everybody to join, and we'll let John get started whenever he's ready. Welcome everyone.
Okay, welcome to the second session of Buddhism in a Nutshell, the second of 5 sessions. It's going to be continuing the next the next 3 Tuesday evenings after tonight. And you're welcome to join any and all of them. There's no need to have done any previous classes. You can attend the second, third, fourth, and fifth one, any of them. Okay, so put on the whiteboard sort of the general topics we'll be covering tonight. I'll start out by defining the word mind and what it means in Buddhism. Next, we alluded to this briefly last time, but we'll go into a little more depth about what we mean by Buddhist, that term, like what does it mean if you say you're a Buddhist or you're interested in becoming a Buddhist. The Eightfold Path, and let's see, I can't remember who was here last week, but does anybody happen to recognize the last 4 bullet points there? Okay. Yep. Yeah, Lisa says it's all about suffering, and that's true. And also the Four Noble Truths is another thing we could call that. I might have tricked you a little bit by putting the last one first, which is the Eightfold Path. But in lots of teachings, I've seen the fourth one presented first because it's kind of depressing if we just talk about suffering and for 3 out of 4 bullet points, and most people might not be around for the fourth one where we say, oh, there's a path out. So we're going to start with that fourth one, as is traditional in the teachings. And then we're going to cover the other 3 noble truths. And just a brief reminder of the logistics. There are 2 bathrooms. If you go outside the doors here and just take a left, there are 2 bathrooms right outside. Feel free to use those at any time. We're probably going to take a break about halfway through, a little bit before 8 o'clock or so. Last week we went all the way until 9 and a couple minutes after, I think. So I'm gonna keep it a little shorter this time to leave plenty of time for questions, or if we or maybe if the air conditioner breaks or something. Let's see, Lisa, if you wouldn't mind holding up the green book. So there's a book that goes along with this class with the same title, Buddhism in a Nutshell, that Lisa is holding there. It's green. And they have some copies out in the bookstore if you're interested in that. And there's also an online course that's taught by the FPMT, the parent organization of this Buddhist center. And for $5, you can enroll in that course, and it also includes a PDF of the book. So that's a nice inexpensive way if you want to look into getting both the PDF and also the online course. And the online teachings portion of that course is from a nun named Venerable Amy Miller. And some of you may have seen her here at the center. I think she's been to the center maybe 3 or 4 times. So I think she's fantastic. And so the course has teachings of all these same topics that we're covering and the transcripts of those. Okay, so let's start with what is Buddhism? Or sorry, what is mind? Okay. So have any of you thought in terms of mind as the brain, at least at some point? I think that's kind of a common view, especially in the West. That's not really the Buddhist view. The Buddhist view is that the mind is non-physical, so something other than the brain. And it's thought that it definitely interacts with the brain, and the mind and body in general interact with each other. And when they come together, that's sort of part of what you define as a a sentient being, of which we're one type identified as human. And the two main properties of the mind that are identified are that it's clear and knowing. So we'll go into a little bit about what that means. So those are sort of the first 2 points I show up there. So those are the two main identifying features of mind. And when we say clear, that's sort of alluding to the fact that there's nothing inherent in your mind. That sort of, at its sort of base nature, it's completely clear and luminous, free from any, particular qualities you might feel like you have now. So, as a habit, we may think of ourselves as, well, I tend to be a patient person, but sometimes an angry person. But and I'm usually quick at things, and whatever adjectives we might want to use to describe our mind, those are just temporary. When you feel like they're in your mind, the only thing that means is that we've had a strong habit recently of developing those qualities. So, but they're not actually in the inherent nature of our mind at all. So, might be a little disconcerting at first to think of that, but actually, I think the good part about that is that we can put in our mind anything we want to, because we don't have to worry about it. We don't have to worry about changing it into something else. It's more about just sort of removing the qualities and the habits that we don't like. And those are generally referred to in Buddhism as positive qualities and negative qualities. Positive qualities being the ones that tend to lead to happiness, and negative qualities the ones that tend to lead to suffering. And so one of the things that we can define Buddhism as is basically the process of filling your mind with the positive qualities and eliminating the negative ones. So as far as the knowing part, another way of saying it is mind's job is to cognize things or to perceive things, or if it's just an imagination, to conceive of things. So mind's job is basically to be clear and cognize things and sort of take on sort of a reflection of what it perceives. A third property of it is that it's beginningless. So that's one of the more unusual qualities, I think, of the mind, especially according to the West, that like in secularism or materialism in the West, we would assert that the mind would begin at birth. And in Buddhism, it stretches beyond that in the past. And not only that, but asserts that it's beginningless, that we can't actually identify a beginning moment of the mind. And I think we're really accustomed to having a beginning and an end of things. Like, the beginning of a book, end of a book, the beginning of our own existence, the end of our own existence. But Buddhism asserts that there actually is no beginning. That the cause of the state of your mind as it is now, the main cause is the previous moment of your mind. And then the cause of that was the previous moment of that mind. And Buddhism says that for some reason they sort of talk in terms of 65 moments of the mind in a second. So sort of in the span of 1 second, there's 65 sort of individual thoughts, if you really zoom in, that you can sort of identify. I've certainly never been able to count like that, but basically each of those is sort of a result of the one that preceded it. And Buddhism would also say that if we try to think of the very first moment at birth and wonder what in the world occurred before that, that gets at the concept of reincarnation, which Buddhism also takes as a hypothesis. And I think the word hypothesis is important because I think it's very unusual in the West to think in terms of reincarnation. And at different points of our history, I think it was ridiculed and persecuted even. And I think the best approach to that is to, even if it doesn't sit with you well, that's completely fine. But if you can practice trying to reject it 100%, like maybe just put it on the shelf and take it as a hypothesis, as sort of an experiment, then that'll sort of help things make sense, I think. Because one of the things that a lot of concepts in Buddhism assumes is the beginningless mind, and the fact that that we existed before the moment of our birth in this life and will exist again in future lives. So another way to say it is maybe taking it as your worldview, just sort of like as an experiment, and see what happens. And in my experience, at least, I've noticed that when I've done that for a while, I begin to sort of soften my viewpoint on some of the things that just didn't make any sense at first. And it does help some of the other things make sense and fit together. So it sort of gives it a chance, I think, to be a cohesive model, if you're willing to at least entertain the possibility of each one. Okay, so another synonym that's often used for the mind is consciousness. And technically, there are other aspects of the mind other than consciousness, but that's definitely the main one that's talked about. And the components of what we call consciousness are the five senses that we're accustomed to, like sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. And also they add a sixth one on in Buddhism called mental. So there's the five sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. All right. Any questions about that? Some of those definitions? And we're going to do a meditation later on the clarity of mind, so we can sort of practice experiencing that concept. So let's go on then to what is a Buddhist? The phrase that's often said, at least in Tibetan Buddhism for a Buddhist, is inner being. I think in Sanskrit, that's one of the translations that you can make for the phrase that translates to Buddhist or Buddhism. And what that means is someone who practices looking inward for things, like for the causes of our suffering, for the causes of our happiness, trying to understand reality. Like instead of the habit that we tend to have, which is looking outside as our first go-to point for things, Buddhism is about practicing looking inward and trying to find answers to some of the same questions that we tend to look in the external world for. And we could even include the body as an external phenomenon. So inner being also refers to just sort of trying to see your body as actually part of the external world and not something that's inherently existent and defines you. So one of the aspects of that inner being is taking responsibility for both your own suffering and your own happiness. And that's one of the main concepts in Buddhism, is that that's where all the causes are of both things, both the happiness and the suffering. So, and there's no doubt that things around us in the external world are conditions, and they definitely affect our lives, and they can, bring suffering and bring happiness. But Buddhism would say that those are only the secondary factors involved in our mind, and that the primary factor is the inner being, or what goes on in our mind. Okay, so certainly.
Let me just say, if anyone has any question online, feel free to jump in. We're very informal. So just you can raise your hand on the chat or just unmute and go ahead and jump in.
Yes, that's a great reminder. Thank you. And I'd be happy to make this a lively conversation. I mean, feel free to ask any questions at any time. You don't have to wait until a designated Q&A session. So you can virtually raise your hand online, raise your hand in here. So yeah, I forgot to put the element up, but I meant to put one between inner being and precepts called the Four Seals. For some reason, that term isn't used as much in our Tibetan tradition, but it's often in general in Buddhism considered to be sort of a definition of a Buddhist, as someone who lives their lives by or believes in these things called the Four Seals. So the first one is impermanence. And so that's sort of the viewpoint that everything that we can see as a phenomenon, whether it's a physical phenomenon or a imagined phenomenon, arises and then eventually decays, so that nothing will nothing is inherent. It doesn't really mean the same thing as eternal or lasts forever. Impermanence is sort of a different flavor from that in Buddhism. It's really more about sort of the moment to moment changing of the thing. And the fact that it sort of at some point will not look like it did when you first observed it. It'll eventually sort of transform into something else entirely. And that's happening moment to moment, sometimes very slowly in ways that we can't see. But if you observe something long enough, the concept of impermanence would say that before too long, it's something else. And another aspect of impermanence is that things are made of parts. So we can think of, for example, let's say this whiteboard here. So it's made of metal down here. I'm not sure exactly what the material is of this white part. And there's a plastic eraser, some ink. And we could also think in terms of the parts as some of the causes that this whiteboard exists in the form that it does. So we could consider parts to be the people who made that whiteboard, or the people who extracted the materials that went into making the whiteboard. And you can sort of go on and on and on. And that sort of meets the concept of interdependence or dependent arising. And that's sort of the flip side of impermanence, I think. So things are impermanent because they arise in dependence on other factors, whether it's the physical ones, like the things that make it up and define its form, or the causal ones, like the sentient beings who took some sort of part in creating that. Okay, so that's seal number one, impermanence. And the second one would be the concept of suffering. And we would say that sort of the existence as we know it, which is not seeing it accurately. So we're sort of assuming that the existence that we feel like is happening now is incorrect, at least in some ways. And the way in which those are incorrect lead to suffering. So that's sort of this concept of the second seal. And if we want to sort of break that concept up into the two main causes, we would say that those two would be karma and delusions, where delusions is just sort of another word for mistaken views, seeing things incorrectly. So the idea about suffering is that when karma, we're going to go into karma in a future class, by the way, so we'll definitely talk more about that. But in general, it's sort of the process of self-creation. That's maybe one phrase to describe this concept of karma. We're all probably familiar with sort of the cultural view of that, sort of as you reap what you sow, or what comes around goes around, what goes around comes around. So yeah, those are all definitely concepts in karma. It's definitely different than the Western view, as most things are in Buddhism. You'll find that a lot of the terms are defined just slightly differently. Things like karma, impermanence, emptiness, permanent, eternal. Seems like wherever we're looking at terms that are just slightly defined differently. And that's a helpful thing to keep in mind, I think, because sometimes when we have trouble understanding a Buddhist concept, it's because we're going by the traditional definition of a word. So keep that in mind and look up the definition before you give up. Okay, so karma and delusion can come together in the sense that when karma ripens, that's a word that they use for that. So in other words, when something that you do in the past has a result that you experience now, when that interacts with your mistaken view of reality, then that creates suffering. So they say those are the two main ingredients. And there are a lot of teachings in Buddhism that talk about sort of, what to do about that, how to address each of those two things, because both are needed for suffering. So in other words, even though you've performed a lot of negative actions in the past that will ripen as negative karma, you won't actually experience that as suffering unless you also have a mistaken view of reality or have delusions, is another way of saying that. So a lot of the process of working towards happiness as a Buddhist is about trying to purify the karma So that word purify we'll talk about next session, next week. So there are ways to sort of soften the blow of karma, or negative karma in particular, and also ways to make the positive karma that ripens more powerful. So, but in particular, we tend to focus on purifying the negative karma because that's really the biggest obstacle that we're facing now. And so if we could at least get a hold on that, then we might be able to have some more space to work on our delusions or look at how we see reality and find those mistakes. And the idea of overcoming that one, the delusion half, is the word that we would use wisdom or emptiness to refer to. Those concepts came up briefly last week. So emptiness is a word that's often referred to as a description of the lack of an inherent self or the inherent existence of something. And wisdom would be sort of the mind that sees that directly, like not just being able to think about it conceptually or come up with examples or sort of have an intellectual understanding of it, but really to sort of feel deep down as a gut instinct and sort of the way you see things by second nature be, oh yeah, that's not inherently existent. So that's the way to accomplish that second part. So the second one probably takes longer, but is also more powerful. So it turns out it's actually easier in the long term to get rid of those delusions and see this thing that we call emptiness as a good way to explain how things exist rather than the way we think they do now. And when we've accomplished that, then karma will sort of be like water off a duck's back. I think that's a good expression for it. That karma will still happen, but it really won't feel like suffering. There might be things like pain or sadness or some of those things that we associate with suffering. I think the Dalai Lama is a great example of how that might be possible, because he definitely expresses sadness. Like when his mother died, he cried a lot when he found out. But when people asked him afterwards and maybe, tried to console him by saying, I'm sorry you're suffering from this, and he would say, no, I'm not suffering. I'm very sad, but I'm not suffering from that. So it's kind of a strange concept to think, because I think our default habit is to think, well, if there's not pain there, then we must not be caring, and it must be apathy or something like that. But the cool part about the Buddhist view, I think, is that you can actually separate those concepts, and it's possible to be completely blissed out even while pain and sadness and those other things are happening. And it doesn't mean you have to ignore them either. Like you can experience the pain and the sadness fully without having the suffering. And it's difficult for me to imagine. But there are lots of techniques in Buddhism to sort of work at that. And that's one of the things that defines Buddhist practice, is sort of working on changing our view of things so that we can sort of get closer to that point of view and start to see the difference between pain and suffering, between sadness and despair. Let's say maybe the different levels that, some of which are just sort of, seeing the nature of things, and others are sort of our reaction to those things. Like pain might be sort of something that you just experience with your senses, but suffering might be just sort of a habitual reaction to the feeling of pain. Another aspect of that I find interesting is that there's a lot of science on the concept of sensory focus, where someone that I've worked with at work has been a statistician on lots of studies about dentistry and different strategies for trying to get through difficult procedures like root canals or even just filling cavities sometimes. And comparing lots of different things, like trying to space out, trying to think about something else. There are lots of strategies that they've tested. And the one that tends to be the most effective in terms of having sort of like a softer memory of the experience, or sort of a lesser sensation of pain or suffering, would be to simply pay attention to the pain, or pay attention to whatever's happening, which when I got a root canal, there was some pain there for sure. But it's kind of nice that there's some Western scientific evidence for that in the studies that I've seen, that was the most successful strategy. So the next time, maybe give it a try if you're interested in experimenting with that. So, okay. So that was the second seal. So we had impermanence and suffering of those four seals, two of the four seals that define a Buddhist in the traditional sense. The third one is the concept that I was alluding to with the word emptiness, the lack of inherent existence of both things that we perceive and see as sort of concrete things out there in the external world, and also ourselves, like our very concept of the self, like what we think of as I or me. That doesn't exist inherently either. It has no permanent properties, that you yourself will change from moment to moment, just like that concept of dependent arising, things arising and then decaying moment to moment. So that's just kind of a property of everything. Everything that we would identify as a phenomenon, whether it's external, internal, something we can perceive with our physical senses or imagine with our mental consciousness, that none of that would have what we call inherent existence. Okay, so that's the first three. And the last one is kind of a strange phrase, but it's nirvana is peace. And I guess, first of all, we need to define nirvana, other than the rock band. And maybe you've probably heard the general concept of nirvana being something cool, like a nice place that you'd want to be, maybe like heaven, or maybe a peaceful state of mind. Probably has elements of all those things, I think. But in particular, sort of like the technical definition in Buddhism would be sort of the state of mind after you have a direct realization of that concept of emptiness or lack of inherent existence. So once you really realize that sort of to the core and eradicate even the subtle mistakes of the way in which you see things as supposedly inherent existence, that the state of mind after you achieve that is this thing called nirvana. And the cool part about that is they say that once you reach a certain level of understanding, then you're set, that there's no way those mistakes will happen again, which I find pretty amazing, because if we study the concept of impermanence, then it seems like maybe one consequence of that would be that, oh, well, all the realizations and understandings and good feelings that I have, well, those won't last either. But there's sort of a special case in the sense of reaching a deep enough understanding of reality, in which case you really will sort of have a pleasant state of mind from that point onward. Now, some of the traditions of Buddhism disagree as to what happens next after that. Some of the earliest traditions would sort of look at nirvana as the end point, like you finish the job when you've reached that point, perfected your understanding of things, and finally aren't attached anymore to this thing called self that you've spent your whole life protecting and trying to make happy and all these things. So some traditions would sort of see that as the end point. And they also have different theories about what happens after that, like the end point meaning as in you wink out of existence, or the end point being you're just sort of in a state of peace that's sort of stable. There are a lot of different interpretations I've seen, but those are some of the earlier ones. And this fourth seal saying nirvana is peace, I think one of the aspects of saying that is identifying that yes, it's something that we can accomplish, and it's something that we can maintain. And we don't have to worry about slipping back down. Now, unfortunately, we do have to worry about slipping back down if we get close, but not quite all the way. And a lot of the techniques in Buddhism are sort of to go that, the last little fraction of the distance, which is said to be very difficult, that we can get to the point of having a great intellectual understanding of it, and even sort of a really nice feeling of the concept and a nice sort of intuitive understanding of it. But it's difficult to sort of get all the way to the core, but not impossible. And there's another phrase, Buddha nature, that sort of gets at that. I think I might have said it last week. I can't remember. But the reason to be optimistic is that Buddha says that we all have this thing called Buddha nature, which basically is the potential to do that job of perfecting your view of the lack of inherent existence and achieving this thing called nirvana. Okay, so those are the 4 seals there. And yes, CJ.
So you said that some traditions believe that nirvana is the end point and nothing else comes after that. I think that is Theravada, or
Yeah, I think so.
and,
I
and so
think Hinayana is sort of the more general word for it, but Theravada is the only branch of that that is still actively practiced.
so what is the alternative to that point of view? I don't think you covered what
That's a great question. I should have covered that, shouldn't I? Especially because Kadampa Center is in one of the other traditions, so we have a different point of view. So, yeah, so the point of view in some of the other traditions is nirvana is not the end point. That what it actually means is that you've achieved the overcoming your own suffering. Or maybe another way of saying that is like individual liberation. Like for your own mind, you've reached that level of peace. But the Mahayana tradition, of which Kadampa Center and FPMT are part of, as is like the Dalai Lama, Tibetan Buddhism in general, also Zen Buddhism. I think probably Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism are the main branches of this one called Mahayana. And they say that what you can do from there is perfect compassion too, and then gain the ability to benefit others. Actually benefit others perfectly, I think is how they would define that. So in other words, I guess that was a long way of saying that wisdom is what you perfect with nirvana and the Hinayana view, and compassion is what you can perfect as step 2 if you have the Mahayana view. And sometimes I hear teachers jokingly say that, like sometimes questions come up like, well, what if you're a Hinayana practitioner and you reach the end point? Like, do you change over to Mahayana someday? Like, what happens after that? And I've heard teachers jokingly say, like, well, then a Buddha will sort of come and tap you on the shoulder and say, come on, quit hanging out by yourself there and come help sentient beings. And so no matter what path we have, no matter what we're studying now, they all eventually lead to the same place, is sort of the view of the Mahayana Buddhism. And so if we practice Mahayana and we sort of look at the Hinayana view, it's not inferior in any way to the Mahayana view, even though it's sort of a subset. Because for certain types of personalities and certain mindsets, Hinayana is much more effective, and people can achieve nirvana sooner with a Hinayana approach. And so some other people might do better with a type of practice that sort of emphasizes both as main factors along the way. And Hinayana definitely looks at compassion, so make sure we don't make that mistake of assuming otherwise. But you definitely need tons of compassion to perfect wisdom too. And Hinayana practitioners, once they achieve nirvana, if they don't wink out of existence like some people might theorize, then they would just naturally have compassion. It's said that the mental state that we might call nirvana is really blissful and just naturally has total compassion. So I think that sounds great. One of the other misunderstandings that I hear a lot of questions about when I attend teachings is whether nirvana might be a tad boring. Like, it's kind of cool to be peaceful, but what if I like to be exciting and, really do cool stuff? Will I still be able to do that while I'm like in this peaceful state? And the answer is yes, of course. But also the other part of that answer is, believe it or not, you'll actually find things that you'd rather do than those things that we think are sort of the ultimate now. So I mean, in my experience, it's definitely a hard viewpoint to shake. Like, no matter how long I've practiced Buddhism, I think I can always think of something that I think would probably be better. Like, oh, there's no way Buddhism can beat this. So it's okay. I just try to practice that thing I sort of said near the beginning of this session tonight, which is to take that on as a worldview, even though it sort of seems far-fetched. I try to at least take it as a hypothesis that, well, maybe it is possible. And so the practice of Mahayana is about perfecting wisdom and compassion. And a lot of the practices emphasize one or the other. And there are also a lot of practices that sort of weave both of them together in the same practice. And one of the interesting things is that sometimes the Mahayana view does things in a slightly different order. It's sort of like you think about this concept of emptiness from day one in Mahayana Buddhism, but you sort of postpone the completion of that task until you reach a certain level of compassion as well, because compassion definitely helps with that effort, because compassion can help give us a reason that's larger than ourselves to do this job. And they say that even though sometimes it might take longer, if you're working on both compassion and wisdom, it'll be a lot more powerful once you do reach that point, if you have sort of compassion as part of the story all along. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I thought maybe we could do a meditation and then take a short break. So last week we did a very short meditation. Sorry, I think you guys sort of got ripped off with the time on that one, but we're going to have more time to do one here. We're not going to practice a long meditation because I don't think that makes sense for those of us who have not practiced a lot of meditation, even some of us who supposedly have. Starting out short is good. Geshe-la has a nice saying, Geshe Gelik, the teacher here at the center, if you haven't been able to see his teachings yet, he teaches on most Sundays and Wednesdays as well. He's on vacation for now. He left recently for a 3-month vacation, so we'll see him in maybe 3 months or so. But anyway, he often says, like, well, when you're trying to think about like how long should I sit and practice, whether it's meditation or something else, and Geshe Gelik says, make sure you quit before you start to feel miserable. And you certainly don't want to make the sight of your meditation cushion make you want to throw up. So definitely make sure you don't go that far. And don't even wait until near that long. He recommends, try to end your session while you're feeling good. So I think that's good advice. I'm very happy about hearing that advice. So we're just going to do sort of a very basic practice of that, using the breath as our focus. So that's sort of the traditional way of doing things. And I mentioned it a little bit last week, but the breath is often sort of the traditional way to start because it's always with us. That's like the one thing that you didn't have to get teachings on before you started your meditation, and you don't have to get complicated instructions because the instructions are basically just focus on your breath. So we're going to do that and practice what we do when it goes wrong, when we think, oh, I'm failing at this, because it turns out it's extremely difficult to focus on the breath, even though it sounds very simple. Those of us who have tried it probably have already found that out. But one way to look at that is that the more you lose your focus in meditation and then practice bringing your mind back into focus, the more you practice. So that means a session was more productive, even if your mind was crazy, jumping all over the place. So the more you practice bringing your mind back, that's actually the whole purpose of the meditation. That's the part that you practice. You don't try to practice the feeling when you're able to focus on your breath. It's really about the practical side of it is about practicing bringing your mind back and making that more habitual so that you can try to catch it sooner when it drifts away and be more effective bringing it back. Okay, so just a very brief reminder of the meditation posture that's encouraged. And there's no need to try to remember it every time, or, it's called a 7-point posture, and certainly no need to remember all 7 points. The whole idea is just to try to be comfortable. So when in doubt, just try to come back to that concept of being comfortable, but also alert. Because maybe the way to be the most comfortable, we might say, is lying down. But one of the things we want to try to accomplish in meditation is maintain our alertness as well. So looks like we're all already in one of the recommended positions, being sitting on the floor, cross-legged, or sitting in a chair. And if you're sitting in a chair, it's recommended to sort of scoot forward a little bit so that you're not leaning against the back of the chair. Unless that's uncomfortable, of course. Nothing wrong with leaning back if it's uncomfortable to try to lean forward. But the idea with the legs is to, if you're sitting down, the cross-legged stance sort of makes it more stable, so you're not going to tip over. I think the ideal position is what they call lotus pose, which would involve putting each foot sort of on top of the opposite thigh, which I can't even demonstrate. I guess sort of you turn yourself into a pretzel, but we certainly don't need to worry about that. The 7-point posture, as it's defined, is really meant for, like the long term when our practice is so amazing. And one day it will be for all of us because of Buddha nature. So one day when we really want to meditate for a long time and be able to maintain that meditation, this thing called the 7-point posture is sort of like the ideal posture for helping our body just kind of take care of itself. So we're arranging the legs and the back, the head and the arms and everything, and to so that when we get in a really deep meditation, we're not going to fall over. Hopefully, we're not going to drool. Like one of the 7 points is to try to prevent drooling. Not that that's a big deal. But, so anyway, once we go through these, keep that in mind. That's sort of the end goal. But really, the goal for now is to be as comfortable and alert as possible. So we're going to start with a motivation and then quickly review the posture and then focus on the breath. And I will give instructions as we go, sort of about what to do when distractions arise. Okay, so go ahead and close your eyes. And before we think too much about the posture, just go ahead and take 3 deep breaths. That will help settle the mind. Okay, now take a moment to do what's called a motivation. In the Buddhist sense, that means taking a look at the reasons that you're here, what you hope to accomplish from this class this evening, maybe what you want to achieve by checking out Buddhism or practicing it in general. And one part of the Mahayana view and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition is to, whatever that motivation is, try to expand that to include achieving your own happiness and also achieving the ability to help others and help them be happy as well. So the end goal being that we're all happy. So one part of the motivation is sort of looking at the practical side of, well, what is already my motivation that I'm practicing now? What's my habit? And then sort of looking at the direction you could take it in. So if you're on the floor, then just have your legs kind of comfortably crossed. Whatever position is the most comfortable there. If you're on a chair, maybe scoot forward a little to the front half of the chair and see if you can put your feet roughly flat on the floor. If that's uncomfortable, you can grab a nearby cushion and put that under your feet. Sometimes that helps if the chair isn't the right height. And try to help your back be sort of upright but relaxed. And I think One of the best ways of doing that is to imagine that there's sort of a string at the ceiling, sort of pulling very gently upward at the crown of your head and helping your vertebrae sort of stack like a stack of coins that are sort of gently apart, just very slightly apart. So your spine is mostly straight, but also relaxed in the sense of being allow out that natural curve and sort of extend it briefly upwards so that it has a chance to spread out a little bit. And your palms should rest in your lap with the right hand on top of the left, both face up. So the left palm underneath, the right palm on top. Relax your shoulders and you can leave a short gap between your arms and your torso to help with circulation. But mostly just sort of find a posture where you can rest your hands comfortably in your lap, palms facing upwards, right on top of the left, and relax shoulders. And tilt your head slightly forward so that you're looking a little bit downward, like a gazing slightly downward, with sort of the feeling of your chin being tucked a little bit. And have your eyes either closed or slightly open, sort of focused at a point at the ground in front of you, whether imagining focusing on that if your eyes are completely closed, or looking at it if your eyes are partially closed. And gently placing your tongue on the roof of your mouth, with the tip of your tongue touching the back of your teeth. And that part's meant to help us be more comfortable, to sort of minimize swallowing and avoiding drooling. Okay, so maybe take one more deep breath once you're sort of practicing that position there. So bring your awareness right now to your breath and have just sort of a normal, natural breath. You can focus on the air moving in and out of your nostrils, or maybe on the rising and falling of your abdomen, whichever you feel is more comfortable. You don't need to follow the air all the way into your body. You just want to focus the attention on the little space just outside the nostrils where the air enters or leaves, or just the activity of rising and falling of the abdomen. That's where you're focusing. So your job right now is to keep your mind focused on your breath as well as you can. You may find that many distractions arise, pulling your awareness away from the breath. But you don't need to attach to them now. You don't need to have a judgment or criticism about them. You don't need to tell yourself, I can't meditate. And this type of meditation that we're doing As the mind wanders off the object, which is the breath, all you need to do is keep bringing your mind back. Bring your focus back to the breath, whether it be the sensation in the nostrils or the feeling in the abdomen. And bring it back again and again as many times as you need. And that's meditation. Okay, so you can relax your concentration now and open your eyes when you'd like. And let's all rejoice. That's a very important practice to do at the end of any Buddhist practice, I think. So basically take a moment to recognize that this probably isn't the thing we'd most like to be doing right now. It takes effort to come to the class, to stay in the class, to focus your mind. All of those things take effort. But one of the concepts in Buddhism is that by trying that, you're creating incredibly powerful positive karma. So you're taking a big step on that path to happiness that I've been talking about. And rejoicing is actually productive. It's not indulgent. It's not selfish. Like there are a lot of ideas we might have about this concept of rejoicing and maybe different definitions. But not only is it defined a little differently, but it's considered one of the most important concepts in Buddhism. And a lot of times when we're having a lot of trouble with the practice, we might realize, oh, I haven't been rejoicing. And sometimes that's sort of what helps turn things around. Okay. And we'll do a little mini dedication. So there's this concept called dedication that we'll also do at the end of the class tonight. But for now, we'll just do a short dedication, which means that we sort of recall what our motivation was. In this case, I forgot to do the motivation at the very beginning of the class, but we had a brief one at the beginning of meditation. And whatever the goal is that you noted, whatever your intention was, and whatever you were able to extend that to, if you were able to sort of reach also in the direction of achieving perfect happiness and helping all other sentient beings do the same, then whatever benefit arises from this practice, you can sort of make a wish that that will ripen in ways that will help you continue in that same direction, help continue your quest for happiness and peace and being of benefit to others. And one of the images that they often talk about is of dedication is if you expand your motivation in this way, and also the dedication to include happiness and the happiness of others, then it's sort of like putting a drop in the ocean. Whereas if you sort of put that drop carefully somewhere, like in a little test tube or on the desk or something like that, that if you come back after a while, would have turned into something else. But if you put it in the ocean and come back, then it's still there. And it's also a nice way to sort of have a sense of camaraderie as well. Those of us all practicing in similar ways can really benefit each other, and because we could all put drops into that same ocean. Geshe Gelik also joked one time that at the monastery, they have another sort of way of thinking about this as participating in the meals. Is that at the monastery, they tend to make one huge vat of whatever it is, like rice or the dough for the bread or something like that. And if you've helped in that cooking process, sometimes the cooks are a little bit late coming back to actually eat. And a valid excuse is to say, oh, I participated in this. So I actually put that piece of bread, I put that part of that piece of bread in the pot, so it's partly mine. So That's sort of another way of thinking of the same thing. So any questions before we take a break? Okay. Feel free to ask during the break, talk, go and use the restroom. Let's take about 5 minutes or so. So we'll come back at about 8 o'clock or a minute or so after. Okay, so we'll just start in a couple moments here. All right. Well, it looks like Kurt stepped out for a moment. Would you like to ask your question here? We have a couple questions to start out here. And
Can I speak?
yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Awesome. I was just wondering how you, or in Buddhism, how with impermanence you reconcile beginninglessness and endlessness, if that makes any sense.
What do you mean by reconcile exactly? You mean like how do you demonstrate that they're valid, or how do they relate to each other? Or
My initial thought with impermanence, right, is that implied within it is some sort of beginning and end with anything that goes through that state, right? If it is not permanent, right, then something has to begin and then end, right?
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, I think I see what you mean. I think the concept of beginningless is, in this sense that we talked about it, is really just meant for the mind itself
Okay.
and for the mind existing at all, and how far ago did it start existing. So, but I think the very fact that you asked that question means you have some understanding of emptiness, because I think a lot of times it takes a while to even think about that. Like, wait a minute, is it the beginning or a beginning? And the distinction between the two might be interesting. So I'm glad you asked the question. Kurt, yeah, I think what's your name, by the way? I forgot to ask. Well, who just asked?
I'm Keegan.
Keegan. Okay. Keegan?
That's good.
My question was beginninglessness. Why is that important? I understand the concept of one thought, one action creating the next thought. However, why can't there be a beginning at some point? And do you have to think in terms of eons and billions of big bangs, and maybe our concepts aren't broad enough to understand that there's no beginning? That's my question.
Yeah, another great question. Well, I guess the first part of my answer would be you don't have to. You don't have to think about a bunch of big bangs creating eons, because it turns out that it's actually useful to think about that concept in a very particular practice that I think we'll probably hit on in class 4, so a couple weeks from now. And that one being the idea that we've had an infinite number of rebirths, and therefore an infinite number of different kinds of connections with anyone we can point to. So, and that's sort of like one of the foundational concepts in a practice that sort of becomes an analytical meditation. And the end point of that particular practice being to develop compassion and the wish to benefit others and to get your own act together in order to be able to do that. Something we'll define as bodhicitta, I think, in the next week. So I think that whole practice will fall apart if you don't posit beginninglessness as a concept. So, because I can be able to think of the Tibetan tradition, they usually use the concept of the mother, like imagining, well, if time is beginningless, if my mind has been around since beginningless time, then in at least one of those lifetimes, if we both existed, one of us was the other one's mother. And then that practice, I won't get too far into that since we'll be doing it, but it sort of leads into, feeling a sense of appreciation. Well, my mom took good care of me, or if she didn't, a mom did. And anyway, that's the answer to that question, I think. Does anybody else have another answer to that, by the way? I'm sure there are lots of reasons why it's useful. That's just the one that comes to mind to me. Does anyone find it to be unhelpful? Like in the sense that not really thinking in that way sort of makes it hard to understand other things? Maybe do you feel a resistance in that? Like not really sure what to anchor onto if you don't have a beginning? Maybe I'm the only one. Okay. So CJ pointed out that we actually didn't cover precepts yet. I think I started to, then got distracted onto something else. So I guess we'll start out with that, and then we'll get back to the Four Noble Truths, which we sort of hit on a little bit last week. So one of the ways in which someone would identify as a Buddhist is taking these things called precepts, which is sort of a fancy word for vows. I think there's a technical distinction between precepts and vows that I can't remember what it is, but a lot of times they're sort of used interchangeably. And there are different types of those, but the main type that we're talking about in terms of sort of like the baseline definition would be the first set of precepts that one would likely take. Doesn't need to be the first, but it's usually the first when someone decides to sort of look into becoming a Buddhist. And that would be the lay vows, which are 5 precepts that are sort of designed to help stop creating so much negative karma and start creating a little more positive karma. And it's often done in conjunction with something called refuge, but that's something we'll talk about next week. But the precepts themselves are to avoid killing, stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, and intoxicants. So those are sort of like the 5 starter precepts. And sometimes you can take all 5 at once, and sometimes teachers offer the option of choosing which of the 5 you're ready to take. And so one of the ways in which you could sort of practice Buddhism would be doing your best to keep those 5 precepts. And then there are methods, if you can't keep them perfectly, then there are practices you could do to help purify negative karma from that. And, so it's not like, it's not like a hard and fast commitment by any means. It's not black or white. But our job, if we take those 5 precepts, is to do our best. And then also practice purification if we do break 1 or 2 or 3. Okay. So last week I mentioned that the Eightfold Path can also be combined into 3 elements, and I wasn't quite sure of them. I did look it up, and I think my first idea was correct, which is that those 3 concepts are morality, concentration, and wisdom. That's not, of course, in every view, but at least in the Mahayana view, and in a lot of the Buddhist views, those are considered 3 important factors. And I'm less familiar with the Eightfold Noble Path with the 8 things separately, although we'll go through those. So the first 3 aspects of the Eightfold Path are right speech, right actions, and right livelihood, which are the 3 that are grouped into the idea of morality or ethics. So right speech being speaking kindly, avoiding things like not just telling lies, but also creating schisms in a community, harsh speech, divisive speech, really any kind of ways in which you can harm others with your speech. So that's sort of the first concept of the morality. Right actions. Actually, I just remember something Venerable Rabina said that I think summarizes these first 2 pretty well, which is zip your lip and keep your hands to yourself. So right speech and right actions, I can't think of a better way to say it. So actions, in terms of the 5 precepts, the only one that's for speech is the lying. But there's also a set of 10, which aren't exactly precepts. They're called the 10 non-virtuous actions. And that one adds on a couple others of speech, which would be the divisive speech and harsh speech. But actions would be the ones in the precepts. Those would be the killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And so the first 2 aspects of this Eightfold Path are being careful with speech and actions with your body. And the third one being right livelihood. And that's kind of a broad definition. But that's the other aspect of morality in terms of sort of how you choose to spend your time, sort of what kinds of activities you engage in and what the consequences of those are. Are they beneficial for others or harmful for others? And in particular, because of the word livelihood, it's focusing on sort of how you make a living, like how you do the jobs that you need to do to earn the basic ingredients necessary to stay alive. And if you combine these 3 together, the speech and the actions of the body and the livelihood, that's summarized by the concept of morality in some traditions. And one of the reasons in which Buddhism, or at least this tradition of Buddhism, groups it into 3, the Tibetan Buddhist path in particular, is because of the idea of the Lam Rim that we mentioned briefly last week, which is sort of the gradual path to enlightenment. Let's say, I guess from a perspective, typically left to right. So in terms of that, the gradual path is often sort of summarized at first in terms of the general 3 categories instead of the 8. So this first one was morality. The remaining 2 are concentration and wisdom. And so with the second one, we can summarize concentration as the 3 paths and the Eightfold Path of effort, mindfulness, and meditation. So just kind of 3 different ways in which we can improve our concentration. So one aspect of concentration is joyful effort, and which means, I guess it's kind of self-explanatory. Not giving up when things are tough, and also sort of trying to look for good reasons to do it, or maybe good aspects of doing it. So that's sort of part of the thing of effort, is remembering to look at the good side of things, even if the bad side is pretty evident. And mindfulness and meditation, one way those are described is sort of like in the meditation we just did before the break. The mindfulness aspect would be noticing when our attention has wandered off to somewhere else. And then the focus of the meditation would be sort of whatever we've decided in advance to focus on, which in our case was the breath. And I often hear an analogy of like a telescope, which I think is nice for this. Like if you're trying to use a telescope to see the stars, you have to know where to point it and also how to focus the lens. So the focusing of the lens is like the focus on the breath that we did. So that's sort of like the lens aspect of the telescope. And pointing it in the right direction is like the mindfulness. So both are required to sort of do that practice. And I guess we need the effort to want to do it in the first place and to get through and be willing to try it. And as Geshe-la says, try it until before the point where you want to vomit the next time you look at that meditation cushion. Okay, so morality and concentration being the first general categories of that. The last of the 3 being wisdom, and that has the remaining 2 of the Eightfold Path, which is right view and right thoughts. And by the way, there are several different synonyms for some of these. So I think some of you have studied the Eightfold Path already and might have a different word for one of these. That's that's totally fine. I might have a wrong word for one of them. There's no really correct version of each one as far as I've ever seen. But view and thoughts are the two words that are often used to denote the wisdom aspect of things. And when we say right view, it's more than just seeing things accurately. In this context, it's sort of believing in something that's antithetical to that. So it's not only, seeing that things are it's not only sort of the ignorance of not seeing that things don't exist from their own side, but also sort of having a strong belief that, oh, that can't possibly be true. So right view is sort of more than just not seeing something correctly. It's also seeing something incorrectly and believing in it. And so right view would be, sorry, did I say that backwards? Yeah, I think I did. I think I said right view is seeing it incorrectly, didn't I? So, okay, sorry. So to correct that, right view would be not only seeing it correctly, but also having confidence that you are seeing it correctly and not necessarily believing it black and white, but at least sort of leaning in the direction of having confidence in that. And right thoughts, I'm actually really not that familiar exactly what distinguishes view from thoughts in this context. So I don't think I'll try to explain that, but maybe once I get more wisdom, I can attempt that. So, but that sort of summarizes the Eightfold Path. And remember which of the Four Noble Truths that was? So remember those Four Noble Truths, there's suffering. Well, actually, yeah, the four are already up there. So yeah, so I started with the fourth one. And that's the one that's, I think, the least depressing. So it's a reasonable one to start with. And so the idea of this Eightfold Path is that if you follow the Eightfold Path sincerely and practice all these 8 things that are grouped into these 3 things of morality, concentration, and wisdom, then that's a great way to do it. And the idea is that, and the teachers who have realized the truth of, at least the partial truth of some of these things, would agree with these 8, so that they aren't just what the Buddha has said. I guess what I'm trying to say with that is, one of the reasons it's still called the Eightfold Path and still practiced is that practitioners have corroborated this as consistent with their own practices. So not just the historical Buddha talking about this and the first teaching of this Four Noble Truths, but also it's been reproducible with people who have achieved higher levels of realizations of morality and concentration and wisdom. So that's the Eightfold Path. Any questions about that? And we'll talk a lot more about some of the practices that make up that path and the remaining classes of Buddhism in a nutshell. But moving on to summarize the Four Noble Truths again, last time we sort of just talked about them in general as being that their suffering exists, it has a cause, and it can be eradicated entirely. So in the first Noble Truth, looking at the fact that suffering exists, we can sort of break it into 3 types to define what we mean by exists. So the first one of those 3 types would be the most obvious one, which is often referred to as pain or gross suffering, or sometimes called the suffering of suffering. And that's the one, that basically means, getting things we really don't want, or being thwarted from getting the things we really do want, and experiencing that either as mental anguish or physical pain, strong discomfort, any flavor of that. But the first type is really oriented towards the ones that are kind of obvious and generally agreed on, and that we experience sort of at the gross level that, we tend to experience in an intense way. The second one would be what's called the suffering of change. And we found one example of that with the temperature in this room. right at the break, it was a little warm in here. So once it got cooler, we all experienced a sense of relief, I'm sure. And if it got too cool, we would probably start suffering from that too. And we would go back and forth. And the phrase to describe this concept is suffering of change. And I think sort of another bold way of saying that is that this is another way of suffering because of getting what we do want. And the reason they word it that way is because another way of seeing getting what we do want is thinking about the fact that that won't last because of the concept of impermanence. So inevitably, until we've reached enlightenment, it will inevitably lead to more suffering, so that even the things that we feel good about will change into suffering. And sort of the practice, when we look more closely at that, would be sort of to try to practice not distinguishing between the two. Like try to get a hold of over this concept of change by sort of putting more equal ground to these concepts of liking something and disliking something, or pain and pleasure. So that's all ways of looking at this suffering of change. And the third one being the all-pervasive, subtle dissatisfaction. So that there are a number of different phrases for that too, but I think probably the Rolling Stones. It's too bad Michael left, because Michael loves playing this and playing and singing this song at the center, and can't get no satisfaction. That's exactly what's described by the third one. And it's sort of also addressing the subtle aspect of it in the sense that even when we might feel like we no longer have any of the first two types, like, hey, I feel pretty good right now, things are stable, but even if we manage to get pretty intense versions of those two, we're still in the back of our mind probably thinking, well, it might not last. Or you might notice that there's something better you could have had, actually. So the assertion in the First Noble Truth is that that one's going all the time in the background. And we might be able to subdue it to an extremely soft voice that's barely noticeable, but it's just always there. So, and that's the toughest one to eradicate. They say, like, sort of in this job of perfecting our wisdom by understanding this concept called emptiness, the lack of inherent existence. Okay. So those are three types of suffering. Any questions about those? Anybody think of a fourth type you want to mention? Okay. Yeah. Lisa says it's already a lot. I would agree. Okay. So let's move on to the second one then. Causes. So I'm sure we can think of a lot more than 6 reasons for our suffering. But this is just kind of a way of breaking it into 6 categories, really. And let's see, I'm going to check my notes here, make sure I get all the 6 right. So the main 3 of these 6 are ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And we touched on those briefly last time. And those are often called the 3 poisons. And if we had to choose the biggest one, we would say it's ignorance. And in a sense, all of the other 5 come out of ignorance. Because if we can get a hold of ignorance, then we would really not have any conditions to have the other 5. But I think on a practical level, the one we really feel the most as a cause is the attachment one. Because one of the phrases that's used to describe the type of existence we have right now as human beings in the vast multiverse in which Buddhism says we could exist. So in this thing that's called the desire realm, that tends to be our main suffering right there, is wanting things. And the next one after that, the one we call aversion, in a way that can be defined in terms of attachment as aversion being sort of what happens when we don't get what we have attachment for. And the word aversion, I guess, comes from, like, if we think of averting our eyes to something, it's not really a word we use that often. That's what aversion means. And so these three are considered sort of the three main ones: ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And then there are other three that tend to sort of derive from those, or are mostly combinations of those three. And the three that got in this one, it seems like a great thing to play Family Feud with, because I don't know if I could figure out which three deserve to be on this list. I could think of a lot of them, but anybody happen to know what these are or have a guess? Or theory about what might make the top six here? Okay. So, do you? Okay. Lisa says pride, and yes, ding ding, you're correct. So, anger? That's probably number 7. Yeah, CJ posited anger. I think technically that's considered a flavor of aversion. So that's probably one of the 6 that would be put under that. But I would certainly agree that it deserves to be at least in the top 6. So Lisa's pride. Actually, I guess all 3 of these terms have different definitions in Buddhism than they do in regular life. I think we talked about ignorance last time already. And attachment can be a problematic because we often use the term attachment in our culture to designate, like loving, like a healthy kind of love, like being attached to your significant other or your children. And nothing wrong with that. Buddhism is not telling us to give that up. What Buddhism defines attachment as is sort of like a problematic, exaggerated idea of wanting or needing something. So if we have a sincere feeling of love for someone, that's great. Buddhism would say, no, that's not attachment. It starts to become attachment if you put that person on a pedestal and start to really believe that there are things that they just aren't. So if you start to, like project qualities onto them they just don't have, and then start believing your own propaganda. So that's sort of what Buddhism says is this idea of attachment. And that's where the suffering comes from, is from the having these mistaken, exaggerated views of something that sort of builds on top of this feeling of already wanting it, needing it, feeling just positive sentiment in general towards it. So if we, on top of that, add these exaggerations and then start to notice that these exaggerated assumptions aren't true, that's when the suffering starts. And in pride, that's another exaggeration, which in the case of pride would be exaggeration of our own superiority to others. So that's sort of how that's defined. And we'll find out in the very last class, I think, there's actually sort of a positive form of pride that we could have. And that's sort of more in line with like we can be proud of accomplishments. And maybe that's one way we could also describe rejoicing, the good kind of rejoicing that I mentioned earlier. So that kind of pride is healthy. So there's nothing wrong with having a positive view of yourself. I heard the Dalai Lama once, the first time that he heard from someone's question in a teaching that they were struggling with self-loathing, like a really poor view of themselves. Apparently, the Dalai Lama required help from his translator. And it took several iterations talking to his translator to figure out, well, what in the world? We don't have a word for this. Sorry. So it turns out in the Tibetan tradition, I think it's kind of cool. I'm interested in the Tibetan culture already, knowing that they don't have a word for this problem, what we might call self-loathing or something like that, that's one of these top 6. So it's kind of cool if the Tibetans have gotten a good hold on that. And the more I get to know Geshe Gelik, the Tibetan I know best, I think the more I get a glimpse of why that might be, because it just seems like, in a way, they have sort of a head start on our culture about this healthy version of rejoicing and sort of an understanding that wanting yourself to be happy is not a problem. It's not something to be ashamed about. So I guess I know our culture has advantages too, but I think it's great that the Tibetan culture already sort of has a head start on that pride one. Let's see. So another would be doubt. So number 5 on the list is doubt. And so many words we need to be careful defining, aren't there? So this version of doubt that they're saying is a cause of suffering really sort of refers to rejecting something out of hand, like looking at one of the things that actually is a fundamental building block in achieving happiness and freedom from suffering. Doubt would be sort of looking at that and just having aversion to it, like really just doubting it so strongly that we're not even willing to consider it, and that creates suffering in terms of just creating obstacles for us to work on the path, because if we're missing an important ingredient like that, then it's difficult to make progress. And in another sense, sort of the positive kind of doubt, that's one of the main definitions of Buddhism too, is in the sense that the Buddha, the historical Buddha himself said, never believe anything I say. Don't take it word for word. You're never meant to do that. That's not how you get to happiness. The only way you can do it is by testing it against your own experience and seeing if it's consistent. So only then can you, really be able to figure out whether things are true. And maybe another way of thinking of this negative kind of doubt that makes this top 6 list is laziness, a particular kind of laziness. And I guess it's not really part of this course in particular, but I've also heard interesting teachings on the 3 kinds of laziness. And those 3 are the obvious kind, like can't be bothered. Number 2 being putting it off, procrastination, like you want to do it, but you just can't bring yourself to it. And the 3rd type of laziness being believing that you just can't do something. And that's just kind of one type of doubt that we can have. And one of the most problematic kinds of doubt that we can have is, just being so sure that we aren't capable of something. And the laziness aspect comes into play in that we don't really try that hard to disprove ourselves. We just kind of lazily sit back and say, oh no, I'm not capable of that. And when is that a problem? Well, usually when it's laziness about one of these things that will end up leading to our happiness and away from suffering. So that's one of the worst kinds of doubt, I think.
I think it's ironic that we're probably thinking, my first thought was, I'm not doing that because it's going to cause me some type of suffering. In reality, the not doing it might be causing the suffering.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I think that means we need to be careful about definitions, right? Okay, so 6 out of 6 on the list. Wrong view. So that's like the opposite of the right view. And actually what I was talking about when I accidentally said right view the first time. So wrong view would be not having the right view. And not only not having the right view, but believing strongly in the opposite, something that's not consistent with it. So I think one of the tough ones in our culture to work with without is probably reincarnation, just because it's so uncommon and to talk about in our culture. So I think it's, as Venerable Amy says, when she gives teachings on Buddhism in a nutshell, she points out how it's very difficult to prove the reincarnation is how things really happen. But she also points out that it's difficult to prove that it's not true. So kind of have both. I think the idea with reincarnation, it's definitely one of those things that if you just reject it out of hand, it'll be very difficult to make sense out of some of the other concepts like karma and techniques to develop compassion. So at the very least, if we want to give it a shot, then I think one of the goals would be to at least soften our stance on reincarnation and just set it aside for now. So, because it turns out that even though we might have trouble in the long term practicing the other things, we can get tons of benefit from Buddhism, even if we totally disbelieve reincarnation. There's no problem there. I mean, I've certainly seen that for myself, and you know, we're by no means saying it disqualifies you if you're not fond of the concept. That's just kind of, I think, one of the things that Buddhism would call wrong view is if we just have this belief that, oh no, that's bunk. Can't be true. There are some interesting books that have been written about it, by the way, and even some fairly thorough studies with good statisticians and stuff. So there's stuff there we can check it out if we want. I guess maybe one of the kinds of laziness would be not bothering to check it out, like continuing to just not believe in it, but not at least give it a little try checking out. So some of these things really can relate to each other, can't they? Okay, well, that finishes our 6 causes of suffering, leaving us with just the cessation of suffering. So as we've, I think, alluded to at least a few times already, the main job of stopping all this suffering is correctly seeing this view of things not existing inherently or not existing from their own side, the thing that we call realizing emptiness. And so that's really the main one. And there are lots of ways to practice that and lots of practices to support it. But ultimately, that's sort of the main way in which suffering stops. Is that's sort of like the biggest mistake that we can uproot to stop the other mistakes from happening. And the practices that we could use to go about that, well, we just went through the Noble Eightfold Path, which is sort of the entire path. But the practices that tend to focus on this aspect of emptiness would be trying to purify negative karma, create positive karma, and develop concentration, and at least some wisdom. So if we're working towards understanding emptiness and stopping the general suffering, then at least speaking for myself, like on the beginning levels of this path, the recommended areas to sort of focus on are these 3. Yeah, purifying negative karma. So in other words, if we think about these things, if we look at these lists on, the 5 precepts and what are the things we could do to break them, we might think, well, okay, I've broken some of those. If we look at the list of 10 things, the 10 non-virtues, and Buddhism has some interesting practices to help purify that negative karma. And by purify, we don't mean you can just, make it go away completely. The idea of purification in Buddhism is that there are certain practices that are capable of softening the blow of negative karma when it ripens. And if done strongly enough, can even have some of the effect of like postponing the ripening of negative karma. And if you can manage to postpone negative karma and finish the job of nirvana, reaching nirvana, before that negative karma ripens, then in a sense, that is a way of sort of completely eliminating it. That's maybe a technicality, but the idea being that you can't just make things go away. So in terms of creating negative karma in the first place, I think that's one reason to be careful, is that it's impossible to completely purify negative karma. The best we can do is soften it or postpone it. And the flip side is creating positive karma, and often that's referred to as creating merit. So the word merit is often used as a synonym for positive karma. And so that's sort of the other practice that's encouraged, sort of when we're first starting out, when we're still learning the definitions of things. We kind of have to take this as a hypothesis to practice some of the traditional practices, like as one of the types of creating merit that they talk about is something that we might do when we walk around the stupa that's outside. You might have noticed the really tall statue, the monument-looking thing. It's called a stupa. One of the ways in which they say that we can create really powerful merit is simply by just walking around it. And there's even like a fable about a fly that landed on something that floated around a stupa, and because of that, created enough merit to be born as a human in the next life. So there are other more understandable ways that they say we can create merit simply by doing the things that are already common sense, like being kind to others, trying to develop patience and lots of practices like that. So, and those can also help purify the negative karma. But it's just, if you just kind of look at the practices that are designed for each of those two things, they tend to be roughly split into those two broad categories. And one of the people, I'm forgetting his name, but one of the people who was here last week mentioned Vajrasattva practice and had a question about that. And that's one of the most popular kinds of purification practices that we do in our tradition. And there's a being named Vajrasattva, or sorry, a deity, which is sort of like a representative, I guess a deity, holy being. There are lots of different phrases for that. But we figured out last week that Vajrasattva is the deity here. Sorry for those of you online. I don't know if you could see it clearly, but if you have looked at these paintings around the Kadampa Center, or you might see them elsewhere, of sort of like these cartoon figures with different colors, with different gestures of their hands and things like that. These are different representations of positive qualities, and Vajrasattva is a representation of the purification of the mistake of ignorance. So it's like purifying karma related to ignorance. And so it's considered to be a very powerful practice, because ignorance being the most powerful of the causes of suffering, the most powerful of mistaken views. And there's a mantra that we recite in that practice. And in conjunction with that, we can do a 4-step process. So I guess the aspect of the figure who's white in color named Vajrasattva is maybe the more esoteric side of that. So it's sort of the more, maybe it seems like, mystical side that might not make as much sense when we start out on the path. The other side that maybe we can start with on a more practical level is this thing called the 4 opponent powers. And that's a really good practice, they say, for keeping negative karma at bay and kind of nipping it in the bud. And best if it's done daily, of going through sort of these 4 steps of identifying things that day that you did that are generally considered to be creating negative karma. Just sort of broadly speaking, things that are harmful to yourself or others. Usually that's sort of the worst kinds of mistakes we can make. And the second step would be thinking about, well, what do I do about this? Okay, I realize I made a mistake. And these things all start with the letter R. So the word used for the first one is usually regret. So that's sort of the idea of identifying the mistakes that you made and just having a simple thought like, oh, I wish I hadn't have done that. And yet another term that we need to define carefully, because the definition of regret in Buddhism does not extend any farther than that. It's just, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And the only narrative that you would have in your head when you had a positive view of that was, oh, wow, that's going to lead to suffering. I really don't want to do that anymore. But of course, our habit tends to be, oh, and I'm a bad person because I did that. Oh, I screwed up. And that would sort of be in territory that Buddhism would define as outside of this thing that we call regret, which is sort of the positive side of it. So we have the regret. The second step is called refuge, or sometimes reliance. And we're going to talk more about that next week, which is sort of asking a question, well, what do I turn to if I want to do something about this thing that I regret? And reliance is another synonym of that. The third one would be remedy, which is to create some sort of positive karma. And the specific kind of remedy that we would do if we're doing this thing called Vajrasattva practice would be to recite the mantra that's generally associated with the deity named Vajrasattva. And also doing a meditation where we can visualize Vajrasattva. And putting both of those together is thought to be most powerful. And so those first three steps, regret, reliance, and remedy. The fourth one would be resolve, or refrain, as it's sometimes called. And that's the step of making some sort of commitment to yourself to not do the thing again that you regretted doing. And it's best to take those in nice bite-sized chunks. Like, for example, you can promise not to yell at anybody for the next 2 hours. Maybe not to yell without apologizing for 24 hours, whatever you want to make up. Just think about what's realistic. And they say that even if you promise not to have anger for 5 seconds, even that's something. So, because if we promise that at the very least, we're admitting that we have anger and that we don't think it's a good idea, and we're at least willing to set it aside for 5 seconds. So, and one of the things about precepts, by the way, just one of the things I didn't mention before is that precepts are seen to be extremely powerful. And if we do precepts as a form of making these commitments. So if we take a precept, like one of those 5 we talked about of refraining from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and intoxicants, if we make a goal like that in the context of taking a vow, like there are formal ways of taking these precepts, the things that they call the lay vows, which we'll talk more about next week. They say that those are extremely powerful even while you're asleep. And I love that idea. That's a good way to practice laziness, is doing a practice that will be beneficial even when you're asleep. So I'm a big fan of that. So even though vows seem kind of scary sometimes, and we tend to think of them as things we are not supposed to do or can't do or get in trouble if we do and things like that, but Buddhism has a very benign definition of them as simply things that you recognize lead to suffering and you decide to not do. I think that's a better way of thinking about it, certainly more positive at least. So let's see, where were we here? Okay, so I was talking about Vajrasattva practice. I guess we covered the 4 opponent powers. Oh yeah, I think I was back to getting rid of suffering. 3 main practices, which are purifying the negative karma, cultivating the positive karma, and developing concentration and wisdom. So only 3 things. That's all we need. So these are the 3 general ways in which we take action on this third noble truth and are certainly part of the Noble Eightfold Path, but sort of when looked at in terms of the practices, those are the main practices we do because of the third noble truth. Okay, well, that's pretty much all the topics we were covering for this week. Are there any questions? Okay.
Hey, John.
Yes.
Hey, Jason here. Love what you're doing, following along. But I do want to ask you this question, and I'm going to kind of compartmentalize this a little bit. Outside of the context of the teachings, when we go back to, and I'm going to relate this back to, because you said, what is it to be a Buddhist? I think in this particular one, and we talked about this in the first segment. Do we have dogmatic principles and ideas of something outside of the common? Well, let me say this. It's almost like looking at it like a Christ figure, right? Do we have that with the Buddha, or do we not? And once again, this is totally out of context of what we're talking about, but I think about it from a historical perspective.
Oh, I don't think it's out of context at all, really. I mean, in our culture, that's the most popular religion. What did you mean by in referring to Jesus? Like what aspect?
Do we have that reverence? Do we have that celestial being and once again, this is a very in my mind, it's a very vulgar question, to be honest with you. But do we have that reverence as a Christ-like figure, from that?
That's a great question. I actually don't see it as vulgar. I think it's a natural question to ask, actually. And I think exploring that is a great way to sort of, look at how Buddhism differs from other common religions. And I think probably the way in which it differs from the other religions that's most pertinent to I think what you're asking about is like the concept of a creator. Because and also maybe
A dogmatic principle of worship.
So it's more the worship side. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. As we go through this process of me walking through this journey with you, it just feels natural. And I feel like, there's not that principle there.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe the principle that's even closer to that even is maybe the concept of an entity out there that can punish you, either punish you or reward you for various things, and which I guess tends to be the main reason we worship people or figures or concepts, right? Often that's punishment and reward that motivate us to do such a thing. And that concept doesn't really exist at all in Buddhism because there's no punisher, there's no rewarder. And Buddhism asserts that we create ourselves, that we're responsible for our own karma. And there are lots of conditions out there and people who can help us, people who are going to harm us, make things more difficult for us. But that there is no particular figure that we're expected to revere. That's not part of the method. It just isn't. There are practices within Buddhism of doing things that might appear to be worshiping or reverence, like prostrations, for example. I don't know if you've seen that or been here at the center, like when we sort of lean forward and go completely flat on the ground and are facing like the Buddhist altar or the teacher or something like that. That often looks like worship, I think. But the important part is the motivation there. Whereas I think in traditional worshiping or reverence, there's an element of like the punishment or reward or maybe fear, or maybe sort of an exaggerated sense of holiness. Like if we have sort of a definition of the figure that we're expressing reverence to, like we just attribute qualities that they don't have. Like we think that it's a figure who can, like that person or that being can lead us to the happiness. And then, worshiping that figure, if we're wrong about that, if they can't actually do that, that's problematic. Am I getting at your question here?
Absolutely. I think I need to let the central figure go, you know?
Oh, no, you don't need to.
Now, I need to let the
Saying that
central
either.
figure go and listen to the message. And once again, let me tell you guys something. Listen, if we just sit back and listen, every time I listen to you, John, man, I enjoy it. It's awesome.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of what else about that we could talk about. So any other parts to that question, or did I hit all of them? Just want to make sure, Jason. Good?
Yeah, all good, man.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. Trying to.
I think it's sometimes easy. I know when I first started studying, it was easy for me to confuse enlightenment with that whole concept of omniscience and omnipotent, and that's how I, as a Christian, being raised a Christian, always thought of God. So it was really, I had to be careful not to think of Buddha as a god in that way. And just basically just, get down to the point to realize that he was a man. He wasn't born divine or as the son of another god or with God-like abilities. But he was a man who just happened to reach this stage himself without any help from anyone else with his mind. And that's what makes it possible for all of us. That's our Buddha nature, to be able to do that ourselves and not depend on another God to help us with that. So that was helpful for me to distinguish and not put so much reverence on the word Buddha, but always remember that Buddha was a man, and they all are. They just have true.
Yeah. Historically
we're
and
non-violent
traditionally, there are a lot of
people.
male depictions of Buddhas.
But without
But there are female ones too.
with those
Anyway.
qualities that we as Christians associate with God.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think some of them Buddha and God would have in common. And well, maybe I should just do a disclaimer here too, that Buddha has no problem with the concept of a God. Buddhism is not anti-Christianity. It's not anti-creator. It's not any of those things. When I was pointing out the differences, I was just merely pointing out that the philosophy is different. The assumptions are different. But it's interesting if we look at omniscience in particular, because I think both Christianity, the view of God or Jesus, and Christianity, a lot of the views include omniscience. And Buddhism also has that view in the sense of, I think they're thought of in different ways, but I think both Christianity and Buddhism would assert that it is possible to know everything. So they just might define it a little differently. I think in the Christian view or the theistic view in general, it seems to be God that has the job of knowing everything. And one of the things that people sometimes develop anxieties about is whether you're supposed to know everything or not. And I think that causes a feeling of confusion. Whereas in the Buddhist framework, the idea is the Buddha is very humble and says, I don't know everything. Like if you met the Buddha in person, and in fact, they do, a lot of teachers say that we have met Buddhas in person. We just didn't recognize them. So Buddha's in disguise, sort of. But they don't really define themselves that way. But they would say that if we perfect our wisdom and compassion, these things we've been talking about, then you would be omniscient. But in a special way, you would understand correctly, you would be able to see reality correctly, understand how and why things exist. But most importantly, I think the key part of the omniscience in Buddhism is that you can see others' minds perfectly. And like clairvoyance, I guess, that's the word for that. And that might seem sort of scary too. I don't really like the idea of someone being able to read my mind. But the thing in Buddhism is they say that the prerequisite for that, something that's necessary to see someone else's mind, is having fully developed compassion. So I think it kind of takes care of itself, according to the teachings I've heard, that the way to get there, to achieve what Buddhism would call omniscience, is to perfect compassion in particular. And even if we perfect the wisdom, we don't have omniscience yet. So, yeah. So Lisa's saying that the idea is that if we could see sentient beings' minds, we'd know exactly how to help them. And I think that's the point. That's the reason you would want to be omniscient. By that time, we would have given up all the external ways of having happiness. So the rest of the job is helping others do the same. Omnipotence, I guess, might be the thing that's different between the two religions. Buddhism doesn't believe in omnipotence in the same way, I think. Whereas most religions, I think, especially the theistic ones, sort of define belief in some being as sort of like a prerequisite to achieving the end goal. And in a sense, that being that you need for that is omnipotent, because only that being would have the power to accomplish that. That it's sort of like not our goal as the practitioners to do that. And you know, if we sort of assume infinite power to punish and reward, I think that's sort of the idea of omnipotence sort of comes out in sort of some of those religions. But in Buddhism, even though they would say that we can develop the capacity to be of perfect help to others, we still have to do it by teaching. You know, we can't reach in and tweak something to do it. All we can do is guide them and help people learn how to do it themselves. So in that way, Buddha's not omnipotent. Because if he was, he would make everyone happy, like snap his fingers, or she. And as CJ pointed out, there are tons of female Buddhists too. Lots of female Buddhist figures. Females have just as much Buddha nature as males do. And if we think in terms of reincarnation, then we don't even really have so much of an identity. That if we look far back enough to beginningless time, we've been female and male lots of times, and all sorts of things that we probably can't even visualize at this point. There are lots of really interesting theories in Buddhism about different ways we could exist. So anyway, any more questions? We're 9 o'clock here. So, do you have one, Kurt? Oh, do we have a mic? If we can get one to him? Thanks. Sorry, I keep on forgetting that for people online.
Real quickly, you touched on the idea of deities, and I think you said they're not people, they're ideas or concepts. So that's kind of new to me. I was wondering if you could expound on it a little bit.
That's a great question too. I asked Geshe Gelik sort of the same question one time, and when I was in the car with him, and his answer was interesting in that, well, some of those figures are definitely symbolism, but some are also real beings that existed, like depictions of real people. And it seems to me that sometimes the two concepts can sort of get intertwined anyway. But my interpretation of his answer, and I'm not trying to paraphrase Geshe Gelik by any means, but like some of the paintings we might look at around us sort of has the purpose to develop the same kinds of qualities that they represent symbolically in the picture. But then there are other ways in which you might look at the angle from, since it's possible to achieve full enlightenment, we might have karmic connections with people who have finished that job. And it's said that some of these figures appear in ways in which beings would appear to us if we have karma with them. So in that sense, they're sort of a representation of a real person or a real being that we have karma with. And that karma itself is sort of our tie to that being. So that, and maybe a way of saying it is, it's more than just symbolism sometimes. So that like whoever appears as like Medicine Buddha, let's take him, a dark blue figure here named Medicine Buddha, that there are a lot of teachings about how the being who became a Buddha and identified as Medicine Buddha, and sort of is traditionally depicted that way, at one point was just like us, having delusions, you know, suffering and things like that. And at that point, we might have had connections with that person. And we still have connections if they've become a Buddha as well. And in some ways, like these figures are thought to be sort of bonds that we can make to sort of help activate whatever karma we do have. And they say that can help meet those people in this life or in future lives if they can help us. So I probably speculated too much in my answer there, but does that get to your question? Or okay. So feel free to leave if you need to. No offense. So we're past time, but happy to discuss more too.
I was just going to say in relation to, you know, the Buddhas and particularly like the kind of worship or the relationship with the Buddhas, I always think of it kind of like they're my inspiration for like the way that I'd like to be, right? Because I think, you know, as a Buddhist, my ultimate goal is to become a Buddha. And so when I'm seeing those representations, I'm thinking of my kind of goal, right? So it's almost like if you have a goal of being able to play guitar really well, you have like a poster of some famous guitarist or something, and like you listen to all the music, and you know, whatever it is that you're kind of aspiring to. That's kind of the relationship here. So you see all of the Buddhas around us in the Gompa being kind of our inspiration, and kind of embodying those goals that we have for ourselves.
Oh, that's wonderful. I wish you had answered his question. You'd have saved me a lot of time. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's exactly that's the impression that I get in teachings too, and something I didn't mention. And I think it's important to mention. So yeah. Right. Oh, and no, maybe one other concept of that, just really quick before we go. But the end goal, even beyond questions like, are they symbolic or are they real? Or were they people? Are we supposed to think of them as people? You know, all these questions. Like even beyond that, the Buddha would say that our end goal is to become like all these figures and symbols. And in fact, that's the practice of this thing called Tantra that we'll briefly mention in the very last class, is that instead of wondering whether that was a person or not, we can practice becoming a being like that. So basically sort of learning how to arise in that form and have all the qualities that form represents. And that's ultimately what we're acknowledging. Like if we start a practice with prayers and things like that, we're not actually praying directly to the Buddha per se, as we are praying to our future self that will be a Buddha. And that the object of reverence, like if we do the prostrations towards the altar, the object of reverence is only what it represents. So it's not the beings themselves, not the Buddha himself or herself. It's sort of our vision of that we'll become ourselves someday. So we're really just sort of expressing respect to our future self. It really just kind of boils down to that. And I think that really sort of distinguishes itself from the idea of worship, because I guess in a way, we're worshiping our future self even more than we're worshiping any Buddha or holy being or whatever. That's sort of the ultimate object of reverence, as the Buddha would say. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to pontificate so much there, but I enjoy that teaching when I hear it. But, okay, well, I guess we'll end the class here then. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And next 3 Tuesdays, doing the same thing, 7 to 9. So hope to see you there. Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.